In the fading glow of an English dawn, when the early mist still clung to the wet stones of the palace courtyard, Queen Elizabeth walked alone through the quiet halls of Whitehall. She often chose these silent hours to reflect, but on this particular morning her steps were slower, almost burdened. The corridors she passed through were filled with portraits, tapestries, and memories, reminders of triumphs, betrayals, and sacrifices. And yet, there was one memory she never spoke of, one secret she guarded more tightly than any political alliance. The story of the lost crown. It was not the coronation crown worn on the day she ascended the throne, nor the ceremonial jewels displayed before foreign ambassadors. This was a different crown, older, heavier with meaning, and tied to a past the kingdom had almost forgotten. Some whispered that it had belonged to a queen from centuries before Elizabeth, a woman whose name had faded from history, but whose legacy lived in fragments of legend. Elizabeth had first heard of her as a child, when a lady-in-waiting told bedtime stories of the queen who ruled before time kept proper memory. Even then, young Elizabeth sensed that the tale held more truth than anyone dared admit. Years later, once she became queen herself, she found proof of that forgotten ruler's existence hidden inside a cracked chest in the Tower of London, letters, fragments of parchment, and a small map drawn in an ancient hand. And though the documents were incomplete, one thing was certain: the lost crown had vanished sometime during a civil conflict long before her father's reign, carried away in secrecy by loyalists who feared it would fall into the wrong hands. From the moment Elizabeth discovered the map, she felt a strange connection. Perhaps it was the loneliness of ruling, or the weight of constant political pressure, but she found comfort in the idea of a queen who had faced similar struggles long before her. The crown became a symbol of legacy, of the endurance of women who bore the heaviest responsibilities, and of the silent sisterhood that stretched through the centuries. But the crown was not merely symbolic. According to the old writings, it was said to represent a pact between the monarch and the land itself. Some believed it had been crafted from metals brought by early explorers, others claimed it contained gemstones from distant kingdoms. But what intrigued Elizabeth most was the belief that the crown carried a message from a queen whose voice had been nearly erased, and so, for many years, Elizabeth kept her discovery secret. Only 3 people knew: her most trusted advisor, William Cecil; her loyal lady-in-waiting, Blanche Parry; and a man whose name seldom appeared in official records but whose skills were essential, Thomas Henslow, a quiet, introspective scholar who specialized in deciphering old languages. Together, the small group attempted to unravel the mystery. Night after night, they studied the faded papers, comparing symbols, tracing clues, and following hints woven into the margins of ancient manuscripts. At first, it seemed almost impossible. Centuries of decay had nearly erased the writings. But then, one evening, Cecil found a passage that changed everything. It spoke of a hidden chamber deep beneath an old abbey in the countryside, a place where loyal guardians had once gathered to protect the crown. And so, without informing the council or the court, Elizabeth made plans to leave the palace under the guise of a routine progress, a customary royal journey across the kingdom. Only this time, the progress served another purpose entirely. The summer she set out on that journey was warmer than most. Fields shimmered under the sun, and villages welcomed her with music and flowers. But Elizabeth's thoughts were elsewhere. At night, when she retreated to her chambers in whichever manor she was staying, She read through the old letters again, searching for hidden meanings. She felt the presence of the forgotten queen growing stronger, as if guiding her towards something essential. When Elizabeth and her small party finally reached the ancient abbey, it appeared abandoned, its stone walls cracked with age, its once grand windows broken. Ivy wrapped around the ruins like a cloak, and birds nested in the crevices. Few dared enter the place, for it was rumored to be haunted by the echoes of past kings and queens. But Elizabeth was not afraid. She had faced conspiracies, foreign threats, and treachery. The murmur of old stones would not frighten her. Henslow found the entrance to the hidden chamber after hours of searching. It lay behind a collapsed altar, concealed beneath layers of dust and earth. Cecilia helped clear the debris until finally a narrow stairway appeared, descending into darkness. Blanche lit a torch and they followed Elizabeth into the depths. The air grew cooler as they walked, and their footsteps echoed in the confined space. Then, at the bottom of the stairs, they entered a circular chamber. The walls were lined with carvings, symbols of crowns, swords, and flowers. At the center stood a stone pedestal, but the crown was not there. Instead, on the pedestal lay a locked box, its metal tarnished but intact. Elizabeth approached it slowly. Her heart pounded. She could almost feel the forgotten queen standing beside her, watching. When she opened the box, she found not a crown but a collection of scrolls, detailed accounts written by the ancient queen herself. They spoke of her struggles, her hopes for the future, and her belief that the essence of true sovereignty did not reside in jewels but in wisdom and strength. The lost crown, according to the final scroll, had been melted down during the conflict to prevent it from falling into the hands of usurpers. Its materials had been scattered, used to forge weapons and tools in service of the people. Elizabeth felt a mixture of disappointment and admiration. The crown had been lost, yes, but not because of neglect or defeat. It had been sacrificed, transformed into something greater than a symbol. And the writings, preserved for centuries, held the true legacy, a message from one queen to another about the responsibilities of leadership. She returned to the surface in silence. That night, as her camp settled around the ruins, she sat awake for hours reading the scrolls. Their words comforted her, reminding her that even in times of uncertainty, she carried the strength of generations of women who had ruled before her. When she finally returned to Whitehall weeks later, she stored the scrolls in a private chamber accessible only to her. And though she never revealed their contents publicly, they influenced her decisions for the rest of her reign. In difficult moments, when Parliament resisted her, when foreign powers threatened, when loneliness weighed on her heart, she reread the writings and felt renewed. The lost crown no longer troubled her. She understood now that power did not reside in metal or gemstones but in courage, wisdom, and integrity. And as the years passed, Elizabeth's reign became known for its resilience, its cultural flowering, and its steady leadership, qualities shaped not only by her own strength, but by the quiet guidance of a forgotten queen whose legacy she had recovered. In the final years of her life, Elizabeth often walked again through the silent halls at dawn. Though the palace walls remained the same, she felt different, steadier, more at peace. Sometimes she paused at a window overlooking the river, imagining that ancient queen standing beside her. And though no crown had been found, Elizabeth felt as if she wore one, not on her head, but in her heart. The crown that had been lost was not truly gone. It lived in the choices she made, in the kingdom she guided, and in the timeless bond between two queens separated by centuries but united by duty. And so the story of the forgotten queen and her lost crown continued, not as a legend of absence but as a reminder of courage passed down through generations, shaping the woman who would be remembered as one of England's greatest rulers, Queen Elizabeth. Yet many months passed before Elizabeth fully understood the impact of what she had discovered beneath the old abbey. Life at court resumed its usual rhythm: meetings with ambassadors, negotiations with Parliament, and endless decisions that shaped the fate of England. But in quiet moments, her thoughts returned to the writings of the forgotten queen. The scrolls spoke of leadership not as a privilege, but as a burden shared with every soul in the kingdom. They described the loneliness that came with power, the necessity of balancing compassion with firmness, and the importance of listening to the faintest voices, those who rarely reached the throne, but whose lives were shaped by every royal decision. Elizabeth began to notice how these teachings influenced her daily actions. When a group of merchants arrived at court pleading for support after a series of disastrous storms, she remembered a line she had read: "A crown is heaviest when worn for oneself, but lightest when lifted for the sake of others." And so she granted relief, surprising even her council with her swiftness. When foreign ambassadors came boasting of their wealth or warning of their strength, she read once more the phrase, "Power is not noise, it is the quiet endurance of the spirit." With this wisdom, she met threatening declarations with calm, and empty flattery with thoughtful silence. But there was one part of the scrolls she still could not decipher. One passage, written in faded ink, spoke of a final message meant for the Queen of the Far Dawn, a poetic phrase Elizabeth wondered might refer to herself. The symbols resembled a map, yet not of any place she recognized. Thomas Henslow worked tirelessly to interpret the markings, but even he admitted the design was unlike anything in known English or European manuscripts. Still, Elizabeth felt the message was important. She sensed the forgotten queen was trying to reveal something more, not a crown, not a treasure, but perhaps a truth about the monarchy itself. One cold autumn evening, as rain tapped against the palace windows, Elizabeth summoned Henslow to her private chamber. A fire burned quietly in the hearth, and the room was lit only by candlelight. The map lay spread across a table, held flat by two small silver weights. "Thomas," she said softly, "you have studied languages of lands I have never visited. You have read writings older than our oldest churches. Tell me honestly, do you believe this message can still be understood?" Henslow hesitated, adjusting his spectacles. "Your Majesty," he began, "there are symbols here that suggest movement, not territory. Directions, not locations. This may not be a map of land at all, but a path of decisions, choices that shape a reign." Elizabeth leaned closer. The idea stirred something within her, something both unsettling and enlightening. "A map of choices," she repeated. "A guide for ruling. Perhaps. Or perhaps a warning." His words lingered in the air. Elizabeth felt the forgotten queen's presence once more, as if urging her to look deeper. Over the following weeks, she devoted more time to studying the scrolls. Each night, when the palace grew still, she returned to the writings with renewed determination. The more she read, the more she realized the ancient queen faced challenges astonishingly similar to her own: foreign threats, internal divisions, conflicts of faith, and the struggle to maintain peace in a land haunted by old wounds. One scroll described how the ancient queen had united her people by refusing to be ruled by fear. Instead, she had chosen patience, diplomacy, and wisdom, qualities Elizabeth herself valued deeply. Another scroll recounted a time when the queen stood alone against powerful advisors who insisted on war, and how her refusal saved countless lives. Elizabeth felt less alone with every passage she uncovered, but it wasn't until the first snow of winter that she discovered the final meaning of the mysterious map. It happened almost by accident. Blanche Parry entered Elizabeth's chamber carrying an old tapestry that had been removed from storage. The tapestry was woven centuries earlier, depicting ancient symbols, crowns, rivers, and stars. As Blanche shook the dust from it, Elizabeth froze. There in the corner of the tapestry were markings identical to those on the mysterious map. She approached quickly. "Blanche, where did this come from?" "It was found in the northern wing, behind a collapsed panel," Blanche replied. "The wardens believe it belonged to one of the earliest queens of this land." Elizabeth studied the shapes. The tapestry showed a series of paths, branching, merging, diverging, leading to different outcomes. It was a visual representation of choices. And at the end of one path, woven in golden thread, was a symbol of a rising sun, the queen of the far dawn. The message was clear. The ancient queen had left guidance not for a place, but for a person, a queen who would rise during a new chapter of the kingdom, a queen whose decisions would shape the future long after her reign ended. Elizabeth felt a deep stillness settle in her heart. She understood now that she had not been chosen by the past to recover a lost crown. She had been chosen to continue a legacy of wise and courageous leadership. The forgotten queen's teachings were her true inheritance. That night, Elizabeth returned the scrolls to their chest, but she no longer felt the ache of an unanswered mystery. She felt gratitude, strength, a kind of companionship she had long wished for but never expected to find. And though she never revealed the discovery to the world, she carried the wisdom of the forgotten queen into every decision she made thereafter. England would remember her reign as a time of stability, culture, and resilience, not just because of who she was, but because of the echoes of a queen who lived centuries before her. Thus the legacy continued, not in a crown of gold, but in the heart and mind of the woman who ruled with grace, courage, and unwavering resolve. Queen Elizabeth, guided by the silent voice of history, became the living continuation of a forgotten queen's hope. Winter settled over England like a quiet veil, softening the noise of the world but sharpening the thoughts of those who led it. In those frozen months, Queen Elizabeth often found herself reflecting on the tapestry and the ancient queen's path of choices. She realized that her own reign was entering a phase where every decision felt heavier, every alliance more delicate, every misstep more costly, yet something inside her had changed. The loneliness that once hovered like a shadow behind her throne felt lighter. She no longer saw herself as the last barrier between her kingdom and chaos. She saw herself as part of a long, unbroken chain of women who had fought, sacrificed, and guided their people through storms far older than memory. One evening, as the court gathered for a small winter feast, Elizabeth noticed the fatigue in her advisors' faces. Cecil looked pale, burdened by negotiations with foreign envoys. Younger counselors whispered nervously about potential conflicts on the horizon. Even the musicians seemed to play with caution, their melodies careful and subdued. Elizabeth rose from her seat, and the hall grew silent. Her voice, calm yet unwavering, carried through the room. "England has weathered more than we speak of," she said. "Our strength has never been born from our weapons, but from the steadiness of our spirit. Let us remember that we are the inheritors of countless years of courage." Her words surprised the court. They were simple, but they carried a depth that seemed to touch every listener. Cecil bowed his head, and even the younger nobles looked reassured. Something in Elizabeth's tone hinted at wisdom beyond her years, wisdom borrowed from the forgotten queen. In the days that followed, Elizabeth became increasingly aware of subtle changes around her. Members of her council approached her with renewed trust. Ambassadors who once underestimated her saw a quiet confidence they struggled to interpret. And the common people, farmers, merchants, and villagers, began speaking of the Queen as if she carried a calm, guiding force. But not all were at ease. Rumors began to spread among certain nobles who sensed the Queen's newfound insight. They wondered whether she held secret knowledge, something older and more powerful than royal decrees. Some whispered of lost artifacts, others of prophecy. Elizabeth ignored the gossip, but she remained mindful of how secrets, even noble ones, could spark fear. One afternoon, Cecil approached her while she sat near a window overlooking the frozen river. "My queen," he said carefully, "there is talk among the lords that you have been studying the past more deeply than usual." Elizabeth turned her gaze to him. For a moment she considered telling him the full truth, but then she remembered the forgotten queen's final teaching: some knowledge guides without being seen. "I study only what every ruler must," she replied gently. "History teaches more than any tutor alive." Cecil nodded, accepting her answer, though she could see curiosity lingering in his eyes. She knew he sensed there was more she had not said, but he respected her too deeply to question her further. Still, Elizabeth understood the need for caution. She decided that the scrolls and tapestry should be moved to a safer location, one known only to her and Blanche. Deep within the palace, beyond a series of narrow corridors rarely used, lay an old storage room with stone floors and thick wooden doors. It had once been a treasury, centuries earlier, but now held only dust and abandoned crates. Late one night, Elizabeth and Blanche carried the chest there, their footsteps echoing softly through the empty halls. When the chest was finally secured, Blanche turned to her queen. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "these writings, they have changed you in ways I cannot yet understand." Elizabeth closed the heavy door and paused. "They have reminded me that my crown is not new," she said. "It is a continuation. A torch passed from hand to hand, and I must carry it with the strength of all who bore it before me." Blanche bowed her head. "Then England is fortunate, for you carry it well." In the following months, Elizabeth's decisions grew even more measured and thoughtful. She resolved disputes with unexpected fairness, chose diplomacy over conflict whenever possible, and fostered learning and culture across her lands. She encouraged scholars to study ancient texts, invited thinkers from distant countries to share ideas, and supported artists whose works would later define the Elizabethan age. Yet through all this, the teachings of the forgotten queen remained a quiet guide within her. Elizabeth began to understand that true leadership required not only strength, but clarity that came from knowing both the past and oneself. Spring eventually returned, melting the last layers of snow and filling London's air with the scent of blooming flowers. With it came a renewed sense of possibility. Elizabeth found herself walking more often through the palace gardens, contemplating the tapestry's branching paths, and wondering which course her reign would ultimately follow. One afternoon, while strolling along a row of blossoming trees, she noticed a young girl sitting alone on a stone bench. The girl, no more than 12, bowed nervously when she saw the queen approaching. Elizabeth recognized her as the daughter of a minor noble who had recently come to court. "Why do you sit here alone?" Elizabeth asked kindly. The girl hesitated. "My lady mother says I must learn to be silent when others speak, so I practice here where no one can hear me." Elizabeth smiled softly. "Silence is a skill," she said, "but so is knowing when your voice matters." The girl looked up, unsure what to say. Elizabeth continued, her tone gentle but firm. "One day you may find yourself needing to speak when no one expects you to. And when that moment comes, remember this: even the quietest voices can guide kingdoms if they carry truth." The girl nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Elizabeth walked on, sensing the weight of unseen generations guiding her still. As the sun dipped behind the palace walls, Elizabeth paused near the entrance, feeling the warmth fade from the air. She realized that she was no longer simply following the wisdom of a forgotten queen. She was becoming part of that legacy, shaping her own path that future rulers might one day discover. The lost crown had never been made of gold. It was made of choices, courage, and the enduring connection between queens separated by centuries. And now, Elizabeth understood that she, too, was leaving behind something far more powerful than a piece of metal. She was leaving a record of a life lived with purpose. A legacy worthy of being remembered. As the days grew longer and the palace awakened to the full vibrance of spring, Queen Elizabeth felt an unusual sense of clarity settle within her. The teachings of the forgotten queen no longer felt like distant echoes from another age. They felt alive, woven into her every thought. And with that clarity came a deeper awareness of the world beyond the palace gates. Reports soon reached her of tensions rising in the northern counties. Nothing alarming at first, just minor disputes between rival landowners, small skirmishes over boundaries, disagreements over old rights. Normally such matters would resolve themselves with time, but something about these reports troubled her. They carried a tone of restlessness, of frustration brewing quietly among the people. One evening, Elizabeth summoned Cecil and a few trusted advisers. "These disturbances," she said, gently tapping her fingers on the arm of her chair, "they are not ordinary. They are symptoms." "Symptoms of what, Your Majesty?" Cecil asked. Elizabeth looked thoughtfully at the map spread before them. "Of a people seeking to be heard. And if we do not listen, their whispers may grow into storms." Her advisers exchanged glances. Most rulers, they knew, would send soldiers or impose strict measures. But Elizabeth refused to rule through fear. "Send envoys," she said. "Not with threats, with ears. Let them hear the people's concerns, truly hear them." It was an unusual decision, but Cecil had long since learned that Elizabeth's instincts were rarely wrong. And so envoys were sent. Weeks later, they returned with surprising news. The unrest was not about rebellion or defiance. It was about forgotten promises, disputes left unresolved by previous leaders, and the people's fear that their voices no longer reached the crown. Elizabeth listened carefully. Each report reminded her of a sentence she had read countless times in the ancient scrolls. A queen's strength is measured not by the force she commands, but by how she tends the quiet grievances that others ignore. That night, Elizabeth walked alone to the old storage chamber where the chest of scrolls now rested. She lit a single candle and opened the box. The familiar scent of aged parchment filled the air. She read several passages slowly, as if hearing the forgotten queen whisper through the centuries. When she returned to the council the next morning, she had made her decision. "I will go north," she announced. Not as a conqueror. As a listener. The council was stunned. A monarch traveling to unsettled lands was unheard of. But Elizabeth remained firm. She wanted to see the truth for herself, and so, with a modest escort and only a handful of advisors, she set out on the journey, one that would become a quiet turning point in her reign. The road north cut through rolling hills, villages of humble cottages, and fields dotted with workers preparing crops for the summer. Everywhere she stopped, Elizabeth did not speak from a distance. She walked among the people, listened to their stories, asked about their lives, and heard their fears. Some were hesitant to speak before a queen. Others wept openly when they learned she had come to hear them. Many expected judgment. Instead, they received compassion. In one village, an elderly woman approached her with trembling hands. "My queen," she said, "we thought the crown had forgotten us." Elizabeth took the woman's hands in her own. "A crown that forgets its people is not worthy of being worn," she replied softly. Word of her compassion spread quickly. By the time she reached the foothills where the disputes had begun, hundreds gathered along the road, not to protest, but to welcome her, and as she spoke to them, she began to understand something important. The unrest had little to do with power or territory. It was about belonging, about people wanting assurance that their lives mattered to the throne. It was then that Elizabeth remembered the most profound line from the forgotten queen's final scroll. "When a crown listens, a kingdom breathes." For the first time, she fully understood its meaning. During her stay in the north, she held open gatherings, inviting anyone, farmer, merchant, widow, or landowner, to speak freely. Her presence calmed tensions that might have grown dangerous. She settled disputes not with decrees, but with fair mediation. She restored rights that had been ignored and implemented reforms to prevent future conflicts. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she stood on a hill overlooking the valley. The setting sun painted the landscape in gold, and she felt the weight of centuries lift lightly from her shoulders. She knew the forgotten queen would have approved of every step she had taken. Before returning to London, the northern elders presented her with a simple wooden carving, a small figure of a queen holding an open book instead of a crown. It was a symbol of gratitude from a people who felt seen. Elizabeth accepted it with quiet emotion. When she finally returned to the palace, her council awaited her anxiously. They expected signs of exhaustion, perhaps frustration. Instead, she walked in with the calm certainty of a leader who had grown even wiser. The people do not need fear, she told them. They need to be acknowledged. And for the rest of her reign, she governed with a renewed sense of connection, one shaped not only by her own wisdom, but by the lessons of a queen whose name had faded from history, yet whose voice lived on through parchment, tapestry, and the choices that shaped a nation. The lost crown, she realized once more, was never meant to be worn. It was meant to be understood. Summer returned to England with the gentle warmth of long days and quiet evenings. The palace at Whitehall felt different now, calmer, steadier, as if the stones themselves understood the change that had settled upon their queen. Elizabeth moved through its halls with an ease that only comes to a person who has found clarity of purpose. Word of her journey to the north spread across the kingdom. But unlike rumors of fear or uncertainty, these tales carried hope. People said the queen had walked the roads like one of them. They said she had listened, not from a throne, but from their own doorsteps. They said her reign felt more human, more alive. Elizabeth did not seek praise. She sought only to serve. But she knew something fundamental had shifted between the crown and the people. The forgotten queen had taught her that leadership was not a display of grandeur. It was the act of understanding the hearts of those she ruled. One evening, as a gentle breeze drifted in from the Thames, Elizabeth returned once again to the old storage chamber where the chest of scrolls rested. Blanche accompanied her, holding a lantern that cast soft circles of light across the stone walls. Elizabeth knelt beside the chest and opened it slowly. For a long moment she simply looked at the ancient writings, the faded ink, the fragile parchment, the symbols drawn by a queen whose name had been lost to history. Blanche watched her quietly. "Do you believe she watched over you?" Blanche asked. Elizabeth did not answer immediately. Instead, she lifted one of the scrolls and let her fingers trace the lines of careful handwriting. "I believe," she said finally, "that wisdom never dies. It waits in silence until someone is ready to hear it." Blanche bowed her head, moved by the truth in those words. Elizabeth closed the chest gently. "These lessons have guided me," she continued, "but now they must rest. Their journey is complete." She placed her hand on the lid for a moment longer, then rose slowly to her feet. As they left the room, Elizabeth paused at the door, taking one last glance at the chest. She knew she would always carry its teachings within her, even if she never opened it again. In the months that followed, Elizabeth's reign entered one of its most harmonious periods. She strengthened her alliances with wisdom rather than force. She encouraged learning, supported exploration, and fostered a flourishing of arts and culture that would one day define her era. But most importantly, she ruled with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the weight and the privilege of her position. Her advisors noticed it, her people felt it, and even foreign rulers acknowledged it. Cecil once told her, during a private council meeting, "Your Majesty, it is as though you wear two crowns, one for the world to see, and one the world does not even know exists." Elizabeth smiled at that. "The unseen crown," she said softly. "The one no thief can steal and no empire can imitate." Cecil did not understand the full meaning of her words, but he sensed their depth. Years passed, and Elizabeth grew older. Her hair turned to silver, her step slowed, and the demands of statecraft weighed heavier on her shoulders than before. Yet her mind remained sharp, her resolve unbroken. One late autumn afternoon, she walked alone through the palace gardens, now quieter than in her youth. The golden leaves fell gently around her as she made her way to a stone bench overlooking the river. As she sat, she felt the peace of the moment settle into her like a warm cloak. The river shimmered under the fading light, carrying reflections of a world she had helped shape, and then, as softly as a memory, she felt the presence of the forgotten queen. No voice, no vision, just a sense of companionship. A reminder that she had never truly ruled alone. Elizabeth closed her eyes. She remembered the scrolls, she remembered the tapestry, she remembered the journey north, the faces of the people, the wooden carving of the queen with an open book. Most of all, she remembered the truth she had learned, that leadership lived not in crowns but in compassion. When she opened her eyes again, the sun had dipped lower, painting the sky with hues of amber and rose. She knew her time as queen would one day come to an end. But she also knew she was leaving behind something far greater than titles or monuments. She was leaving a legacy of wisdom, courage, and understanding, echoes that future generations might one day trace, just as she had traced the teachings of the forgotten queen. Elizabeth rose from the bench, standing tall despite her age. Her gaze swept across the river, the gardens, and the towering palace behind her. The crown was never truly lost, she whispered to the wind. It simply changed form. And with that, she turned back toward the palace, toward the responsibilities that had shaped her life, and the people who had walked beside her through every choice she had made. Her steps were steady, her heart calm, for she knew, as the forgotten queen had known before her, that a ruler's true crown was invisible, worn not upon the head, but upon the soul. And so the story of the lost crown came to its quiet, powerful end, not with the recovery of gold or jewels, but with the realization that its truest form lived on in the heart of a queen remembered forever, Queen Elizabeth.